basically responsible to bring changes to our country.
The LGBT community in Georgia is one of the most vulnerable in terms of poverty.
Welcome to this panel discussion on human rights and housing with perspectives from Eastern Europe as part of the Human Rights Days event. My name is Sofia and I'm a coordinator working at ForumCiv as a project coordinator of the Swedish Civil Society Network for Eastern Partnership and Russia. This webinar is organized in cooperation with members of this network, figuring different Swedish civil society organizations. In this moment, when we record this webinar, the world is in the middle of trying to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. We have just entered the year of 2021 with the hope and aspiration that it will be better than the past year of 2020. Last year left the whole world in a situation of shock and crisis as the virus swept over continents and took nations with surprise. The health consequences have been devastating in a number of ways, but not only in the way that people would expect out of a virus. In many cases, the risks that people have faced have been depending on how and with whom they live and what groups of society that they belong to. In this panel discussion, we aim to highlight perspectives from women, from LGBTQI communities, and from youth, and particularly address the situation in some of the countries in the Eastern Partnership region, which is 6 countries in the east part of Europe, just outside of the EU. More specifically, we will have guests from Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia visiting us in this studio. However, we will also reflect on similarities and differences with the situation that we have here in Sweden, and therefore we have a guest representing a Swedish youth organization. So we hope that this discussion will leave you with an increased understanding of how living conditions for different marginalized groups have affected health and well-being of these groups, but also what possibilities, methods, and tools that exists when working to support and empower civil society in the Eastern Partnership region and Sweden. The consequences of COVID-19 have been different for different groups of the population. One clear trend is that women was hit especially hard, not necessarily due to the virus itself, but more so, unfortunately, in connection to the restrictions imposed on the society in relation to dealing with the pandemic. So with the lockdowns that followed with the pandemic, the world could unfortunately witness a peak in cases of domestic violence. Thus, the vulnerability of women is closely connected to how and with whom they live and what kind of protection and support mechanism that they receive in connection to sexual abuse, domestic violence, and mental health support. In Western Ukraine, in a city called Lviv, we find an organization called Women's Perspective that provide direct support for female victims of violence and discrimination. They also work with law enforcement, judiciary, and support governmental bodies to improve the Ukrainian state response to issues of violence against women and gender discrimination. The organization also tries to prevent and combat violence against women through advocating for change in the legislation and conduct research. Marta Chumalo is the deputy head of Women's Perspective and has long experience of helping victims of human trafficking and domestic violence for many years. So Marta, what do you see as the main risks and challenges for women in Ukraine today, and what can be done to improve their living situation?
Thank you. Thank you, Sofia, for presentation of me and my organization. Yes, in Ukraine we have a few big challenges. First of all, I have to say about work migration because many women were work migrants, and now when borders are closed, these women lost their jobs, and here in Ukraine many women lost their jobs, and they are really economic depend from their perpetrators, and we have a few cases where women come back to their perpetrators because they don't have possibility to rent separate in another apartment, and they have to live with perpetrator. Second, or another challenge was really problems with access to shelters and access to services, because public transport was banned, and very often women don't have cars, and they stay with perpetrators at home, and our shelter was we don't have we didn't have places, and we decide to rent another apartment for shelter, and we have two shelters, and all places are this okay, and what I have to say, we have big problems with access to medical medicine services, because COVID is on the first line, and all different needs, for example, gynecological needs, or some other suffers, is very often refused, because women who ask about medical services are asking about postpone and about later asking. So I have to say that we had UN Women had big analysis about COVID and women, and we had seen that 83% medical professionals who are involved in COVID system, medical COVID reaction are women in Ukraine, are women, and so all this women are in biggest risk, and their family also is in really vulnerable situation. And I have to say, most influence now we see on a vulnerable group of women, such IDPs, because they lost their job. Very often is unofficial job, and they cannot rent apartments, and they don't have any. Now they have really
really hard situation, because without money, without any possibility to find a job, they are in crisis. The same situation is with single mothers and women who is suffer in domestic violence. So we had big challenges for us with this influence of COVID.
Thanks a lot, Marta. So what does the Ukrainian government and local authorities do to protect and support the safety and security of women in this region?
I would say that our government is reactive. They don't do for I don't know, for prophylactic problems, or for they do as react. They react, and now a few years ago we had big challenges in law regarding domestic violence, but Istanbul Convention is still not ratified, and we have urgent prohibiting orders for the 10 days. We have restraining orders for 6 months. We have already criminal responsibility for repeated domestic violence, and we have criminal responsibility for violating of restraining orders. But in COVID conditions, very often we have problem with all these orders, because police sometimes say that he doesn't have where he will go, and we have problems with realization of our law and using of our law.
Thank you, Marta, for highlighting the essential role that women's rights organizations in Ukraine are playing, but also highlighting the increased needs and risks that women are facing in light of the COVID pandemic and the increased restrictions in the Ukrainian society. So I'm really happy that your organization is doing such important work, but more needs to be done. Let's move on then to the context of Georgia. So one of the groups of society that before COVID hit the world already suffered from discrimination and marginalization is the LGBTQI community. Respect and protection of people that do not follow the heterosexual norm has been a big problem in many countries, and some would argue that the situation in the Eastern Partnership region is especially difficult due to widespread homophobia and traditional values. So in Georgia, the feminist organization Women Initiative Support Group, WISG, aims to support the formation of a society based on principles of social justice by empowering women and raise awareness about equal participation in social, political, cultural, and economic life. So WISG promotes LGBTQI women in all levels of society, but they also do advocacy activities and organize events to raise awareness about equality, feminism, women, and LGBTQI rights. That brings me to introduction of the next speaker, Natalia Mchedlishvili. So Natalia is working at WISG as an informal education and research coordinator. She's involved in planning, organizing, developing, and networking community strategies, as well as informal educational activities on sexual orientation and gender identity. So Natalia, how would you describe that the living situation and well-being for marginalized groups in Georgia has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and the general development in the country?
Thank you for introduction, Sofia. I would add that WISG is a member of Eastern European Coalition for LGBT plus equality that you have mentioned in the beginning of your speech. So thank you for your question. And I think to kind of perceive the context adequately, we kind of need to overview the historic situation also, which is really especially common in this context of this conference. And I think the core basis of the inequality that we're going to talk right now during my speech is that the issue of housing as a social issue is not perceived as part of welfare policies, but as a product on the trade market. And these tendencies started to uprise right after the collapse of Soviet Union. So these experiences, I believe, common for post-Soviet countries and societies. And these happened like to perceive the housing policies as part of a trade market and the free market instead of welfare. Was a part of this global demand and vision of development, right, in the beginning of 90s. But this global demand also included demand on legislative development, like regulating the market as well as considering human rights in terms of housing and other economic development parts, right? So to confirm to these new standards of living and development, countries had to adjust legislation, and on the other hand, societies had to adapt to develop these new skills of making business, for example, and trade and so on. Yet, not every society could adapt easily to these new standards of living, and Georgia by the time was one of the poorest, as the wars in 1990s and other traumatic experiences like civic crashes all over the country and so on, and other traumatic experiences brought us in a very critical social and economic conditions. But throughout these 30 years till now, of course, Georgia had been moving forward with the effort of like local and international organizations, and also by time, of course. And we time to like during this period of time adapted like many democratic approaches in our social and political life. Yet the core vision of this economic development did not change. So right now we ended up with a neoliberal market creating favorable conditions for economic elites, like banks that offer Kabbalic conditions on loans and other services, big companies and investors and so on. Among them were those who were responsible for building houses, like in this, if we speak of the housing policies, right? But again, as a product on the market, but not a social good to be distributed to different vulnerable groups, right? So all this describes, all that I have described right now creates terms of significant social and economic inequality. And not figuratively, I say that rich get richer and poor get poorer. And this circumstance especially is clearly observable in terms of crisis times, and in this case, COVID pandemic. And to emphasize now, to bring in the subject of the community I represent now, is of course not a homogeneous group or unity of people, right? In terms of accessibility on social goods like education, employment, and healthcare that you highlighted in your introduction, and also shelter and ownership of property. But speaking in general, and based on my analysis in the beginning, the community, LGBT community as a social group in Georgia, is one of the most vulnerable in terms of poverty and particularly homelessness. In case of queer people, poverty and homelessness is in tight correlation with homophobia, of course, of different level, domestic violence, discrimination, and gender-blind welfare policies. These are the challenges that queer individuals, their families and relatives face from the day they come out, or just because someone suspects them to not be normal in terms of gender expression or identity. So as a result, queer individuals in Georgia either choose to move out of parents' homes to kind of avoid the conflicts, but these are ones who can afford renting flats or sharing a room with a friend, right? Either these individuals are kicked out of their homes in a significant number of cases with no hope to ever return or get a chance to receive realty as inheritance as a future shelter or home. This is why we claim that stay-at-home strategy that was recommended from authorities worldwide, on the other hand, was preventing us from the virus, but also putting many at risk of violence and mental health issues. Many living in these tough social circumstances are imposed to work in precarious conditions, often in consumer services or other fields of also unregulated private sector. And Georgian Parliament recently started to kind of bring in discussions of labor rights or minimum wage, with kind of an insurance for the working class, I would say, or people who work in this precarity and so on. These working conditions were also really a term of vulnerability. As I mentioned, these little businesses that queer community was employed in, right? These were the most harmed in terms of COVID-19 regulations, like bars and restaurants were closed, and so on. I think this is really common worldwide. So also as and I would like to highlight, as the local welfare system does not include housing strategies, especially the strategies that would somehow cover issues of the community, emergency needs of housing are addressed by community organizations like WISG, and there are several others, and local shelters. But also how to get in the shelter is also challenging for all individuals that are victims of violence, but especially for LGBT community members, as they often face institutional homophobia. They have challenges reporting the violence because there is no trust towards the state institutions and how they are going to be treated there. And also, on the other hand, these services, of course, are not permanent, right? These shelter services, I mean. And after leaving the institution, a queer individual is very likely to be left excluded from the social life with no strong support network or any sustainable social services. And to sum up, as I perceive it personally and how we perceive it strategically, is that in line with this uprise of neoliberalism in Georgia and the idea of development and not sustainable and fair strategies, unfortunately, our authorities, like throughout these 30 years, sacrificed best interest and welfare of many citizens, ones that were most vulnerable socially and economically. And among them, we see LGBTQ individuals. The way out would be, I think, an adequate social policies and inclusive social policies, which would cover issues of accessible housing as a basic human right, I would say, for everyone, like for LGBTQ community, as well as IDPs, and was mentioned by previous speaker, and women who are facing violence and so on. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Natalia, and thank you for highlighting the importance of social policies in terms of housing and the accessibility of housing. But as a follow-up, do you think that also the general awareness of the vulnerability of this group in the society has increased due to the current development, or is it still a bit unknown for the general public in Georgia?
Thank you for your question, Sofia. Well, societal attitudes are witness to change, and this is a really long process. WISG, for example, does this research on social attitudes once in 5 years, and this year we're gonna conduct this large-scale study, and in line with the inclusive legislation, attitudes change, but without the will of authorities, this is not going to happen. The issue is systematic and institutional on the first line.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. So building on what Marta and Natalia have presented, this naturally leads us to the next topic of this discussion, which is how youth have been affected and what limitations and possibilities that young generation is facing in terms of influencing their life and living conditions in relation to safety. So for this focus, we will particularly look at the context of Armenia, a small country neighboring to Georgia in the South Caucasus region. So this is why I'm especially happy to welcome Grigor Yeritsyan to this panel. Grigor is a political scientist, a civil society activist, and a youth worker in Armenia with considerable practices in consolidating youth. He has been working for civil society development in Armenia since 2007, both in terms of academic research and practical work. In 2007, Grigor co-founded the organization Armenian Progressive Youth. So today, this organization is a big youth network with hundreds of beneficiaries in Armenia and beyond. So for this last decade, the organization has been mainly working in the areas of youth policies, democratic and active citizenship education, and youth participation. So the mission of the organization is to promote active citizenship and active participation of young people in civic life in order to increase the activism of young people and contribute to the general development of civil society in Armenia. So thank you for joining us today, Grigor, in this panel. What do you view as the young people's possibilities and limitations from the perspective of inclusion and youth participation in decision-making processes, and how are the rights perceived among youth connected to their access to housing in Armenia?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, actually, numerous researchers confirm that unemployment and housing are one of the most important issues in Armenia. And what my colleagues in Georgia and Ukraine said a lot resonated also with the situation and the context here. And researchers show that housing and unemployment are also the main obstacles, impediments for young people to start a family or to pursue their personal goals. In Armenia, unemployment among young people is the highest in the region. It is about 32% according to the state statistics, but actually, according to independent research, it's up to 36, 37%. It is alarming that unemployment among female young people is much higher than among young men. And of course, COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation here. Not only COVID-19, but also the recent war that Armenia has been going in the recent month with its neighboring country. As a result of the war, a lot of people were left homeless, displaced. A lot of young people have died, and the overall economic situation has worsened. So basically, due to the recent war and the COVID-19 pandemic, there are less available jobs for young people, there are less quality jobs for young people, and of course, the housing is less accessible for young people. A few years ago, we have been doing research on what is the main obstacle for young people to participate in the society. And it was very interesting to see that most of the young people, both in big cities and small towns all across the country, mentioned employment as the number one problem. Employment, and of course also the discrepancies between the labor market demands and the educational sector. The gap between education and labor market is also contributing to the situation. Now, post-COVID situation and post-war situation in Armenia creates totally new challenges. On one hand, lack of quality jobs, lack of decent jobs, lack of housing, and on another hand, new working ethic emerging, new ways of applying for a job, working online also created a lot of new challenges, digital divide, a lack of digital skills that a lot of young people face. What is also important to mention is that young people in Armenia are very different, and it depends whether you live in a big town or in a rural area, because your problems would be very different. And for young people in rural areas, for example, one of the issues is not only employment, but also access to education, also being far from main administrative cities where all the infrastructure exists. In many places, rural places, there is even no transportation well connected to the main towns, which is also contributing to overall situation. When we look at the gender perspective of unemployment in Armenia, we see that the active economic labor force among women is only 50%, while among men it's 70%, which means half of the women in Armenia don't work. And this is, of course, affecting the overall economic situation. Generally, the situation of young people connected with housing, with employment, should be seen in a wider socio-economic context of Armenia, I guess. On one side, a recent war that damaged the economy, the pandemic, but also years of abuse of power in this country by different political elites, oligarchs, and this results also in a massive brain drain, in a migration. A lot of young people see a future in the country, so they prefer to move abroad, seeking for better jobs and better living conditions or better education. And this is very sad, because young people are basically the most important resource of any country, and seeing this resource migrating is very unfortunate. Well, I would sum up here the general overview, and if there are any questions, I'd be glad to respond.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Grigor. And I understand that the context is very different from different parts of the Eastern Partnership region, but that youth are affected in terms of access to housing and access to the labour market. But do you think there's anything that different youth organisations in the Eastern Partnership can do to support each other and cooperate with also EU organisations with the same aim?
Well, I believe in this cross-border collaboration and the added value of international collaboration. We have seen many good examples as an organization, especially that we in Eastern Partnership have actually a very similar context. So we can learn a lot from one another, exchange best practices to see what works, what doesn't, what can be improved or replicated in the country. And meetings like this, but also in general, international networks can definitely play their role. I'm part of several international networks, such as Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum, for example, that brings together civil society organizations, both in Eastern Partnership and the European Union, giving them a platform to talk, to brainstorm, to discuss common challenges, and to come up with joint solutions. I think this is very important because sometimes you can think global, but give very local solutions. And this is why APY, the organization that I work for, has a lot of regional collaboration projects involving different Eastern Partnership countries, but also EU countries. As I said, there is a lot to be learned from one another. And especially that Armenia is undergoing a lot of transformations in the last years, transformations that many other countries in the EU have been going previously. So we can definitely look at these lessons learned and see what has been successful, what has not been successful. And young people, I guess, are in the forefront of this people-to-people contact, of this collaboration, because we are more mobile, we are traveling. Well, we were traveling when it was possible. We're basically responsible to bring changes to our countries.
Thanks a lot, Grigor, for highlighting the importance of regional cooperation and how different organizations in the Eastern Partnership and the EU can build on each other's knowledge and establish closer cooperations, and also for highlighting the importance of the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum. After these interesting presentations from the local context in Eastern Partnership, it becomes important and exciting to connect back to the Swedish context and draw on what kind of trends that we can find here and which similarities and differences that exists. So Fryshuset is the biggest youth organization in Sweden and has worked for the empowering of youth since 1984 by offering youth activists trainings, recognitions, and possibilities to act and raise their voice. So Amao has long experience of working for increasing young people's participation and engagement. Which is strongly reflected in her current position as a development officer at Fryshuset, with a focus on young participation and organization. So at Fryshuset, she works strategically with municipalities in Sweden to increase young people's influence in decision-making processes on issues that affect the life and well-being of youth. So, Shade, how would you describe the similarities and differences with the situation that we have in Sweden for youth, with the context in Eastern Europe, and what is Fryshuset doing in Sweden?
So I think, first of all, thank you for having me here, and it's been really interesting to listen to all of you. So when it comes to youth engagement in Sweden, I can begin with saying that civil society has a very strong history of organization in Sweden, and it's certainly true for young people as well. We have a fairly strong organized sector with formal ways to engage in society, either if it's through politically, through youth political parties, or through NGOs like Swedish Red Cross Youth. So if you're an engaged youth, basically you can find many different organizations depending on your interests. And another strong way to get organized is also through sports. That's actually how I became so invested in youth and inclusion. I started through basketball, and then I made my way through the jungle of civil society organization. However, the global trend of informal ways of youth engagement is also visible in Sweden, especially for us that work at Fryshuset. We meet a lot of youths from all different backgrounds, especially vulnerable groups. And for some, these formal ways of organizing, like through youth political parties, is not an option, or at least not yet. And it can be because of issues of lack of trust, lack of representation, hierarchical structures which limit young people's influence. It can also be about like these young individuals themselves who may feel that they don't have enough tools or just not a belief in their own future to be able to engage formally to make a difference. This, however, does not mean that they do not have like a political or societal interest. On the contrary, many of these youths find other ways to engage in issues that stand especially close to them. And I think this is like, you can say this globally, but social media is a really popular tool, and you can find many, for example, Instagram pages where youth aim to spread knowledge about issues close to them, but maybe that are not listed in formal areas. For example, the history of Black people connected to Sweden. You can read about it a lot on Instagram, but maybe not as a lot on the government topics. Furthermore, if you just look at how Fryshuset organized, we have a lot of like youth trainings about tools for self-empowerment, self-leadership, leading in communities, which are based entirely on the needs of youth and the situations and issues that are relevant in their own communities. So I see that it is necessary to work in these both arenas for youth engagement, where the structured forms are still the ones that, for example, government and municipalities consult in decision-making processes primarily. And this means that if we're going to make decisions that reflect all experiences of youth, not only like the empowered and people who come from resource-strong areas, all youth need to be represented. At the same time, you can't ignore that the informal arena is a good place with capacity to reach a sort of broader societal change, as youth are not bound to bureaucracy or other structures, but can instead be based on like creativity and collaboration. And listening to the fellow speakers here, I think it's really fascinating to understand that, you know, it's all about what groups of youth we're talking about that are facing different kind of challenges. For example, the COVID crisis has really highlighted that we have our challenges in Sweden as well, very much connected to your socioeconomic background. So in Sweden, we kind of went the other way when it comes to restrictions and lockdowns. And we were kind of hoping that people would be smart enough to get that you need to stay inside, which has been one strategy. But however, what this has highlighted and what you can see is that some groups just don't have the possibility, they don't have the situation to just stay inside, because if they stay inside, they can't work, and if they stay and if they can't work, they can't live. So they have to move through the cities just as they done before. And these groups are also the ones that are living in housings that are quite small, and the families are big. So it's there's a tight space, and there's a lot of like issues that affect their lives normally every day in very challenging ways. But when the COVID crisis came, it was very much visible how problematic the situation for some groups in the society are, like these vulnerable groups. And so what has happened then is that a lot of these youths have then spoken out in these informal arenas to just like highlight that, okay, this is what we're talking about when we say that Sweden isn't so as just as many people would say, that that some people experience mistrust in the governments because they feel excluded, they feel left out, or forgotten. Yeah, I would just say that, like, to sum up, really, of course, we have a lot of opportunities in Sweden. Goes without saying almost, but still we have our challenges, and we have to like always be able to look at these both spaces to see what can we do and how can we do better.
Thank you for highlighting how the housing situation for young people corresponds to what risks that they are forced to take when moving in the public space or transporting themselves to their work. I think it's very core to also show that the challenges are universal and exist in Sweden just as well as elsewhere. But just as a follow-up, so how does Fryshuset work to strengthen young people's participation in decision-making internationally? And is the methodology of Fryshuset applicable in other contexts as well?
So Fryshuset works a lot directly with youth through different ways and tools in order to ensure that all youths can engage in the society in every way that is available. The basis is to always begin on youth terms, to show trust and lead by example, and to believe that youth are capable and show them that this belief in them. To reach youth who feel excluded, we work first and foremost with building trust and relations. After that, we strengthen them with tools and encourage them to meet other youths. And finally, we try to create platforms for them to independently influence their surroundings or their own lives. And what can I say about how this type of methodology can be applicable in an international context is that, we really try to base our work at home, but as well internationally on the local context. You can't do anything, you can't reach these people if you're not like what we call a credible messenger. So what we see is that in order to work internationally is so very, very important to collaborate with the local organizations that have the knowledge, that have the familiarity of their surroundings, and that actually know the history of the countries we're going to, because obviously Sweden has a totally different history that has affected our way of doing things. So we can't just come in and assume that we can change somehow these societies. However, what we do find that is important is that our way of thinking, our way of trying to work with youth through this like equality, putting focus on equality and not making youths any different than adults, for example, and really appreciating what the youths themselves can bring to the table. That is what we want to spread, and that is also what we want to use in order to understand how every youth are living their lives. And I thought about, like, when I heard the situation in Georgia, you mentioned like how social attitudes are really important. And I think that in Sweden, since we have like come away when it comes to like the material inequalities, of course we still have ways to go there, but we have now put more focus on these like social norms and stuff like that. We work really hard with them in Sweden as well. And I think that is what we also can bring to the table, like new tools and new ways to try to change attitudes and have dialogue actually in order to change attitudes. Because Fryshuset works with a lot of different groups. Sometimes we work with groups that are quite actually opposite of each other. So then the obvious and very challenging question becomes, how do you create dialogue between people that actually are against each other? I think this is the kind of like methodology that could be useful in different areas of the world. I'm not going to end there.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. I think that's also a great way to bridge on the similarities and differences and how to use different methodologies when reaching out to these groups in Sweden as well as in the Eastern Partnership. So I don't know if Natalia, if you want to comment on that, because it's a very nice connection with the Georgian context.
Yes, actually, I wanted to refer to starting a dialogue between groups, right? Because in Georgia, we have like many issues that cause clash between different groups of people, which is like basically in most of the cases based on the political interests, like really shallow political interest that is also promoted by mainstream media. And I think that how we, the civic society activists and organizations could deal with it is to kind of start the dialogue in terms of highlighting and underlining the issues that we have in common. And I think that this is the universal method of creating inclusive society, and also to synthesize different groups that are aggressive, and because the reason why I'm saying it is that like one of our large-scale studies even showed that the homophobia is in tight correlation with not being familiar with people, not knowing actual gay person, you know? So to start a dialogue there, to of course in line with rising visibility and also integrating in different public spaces would also be a good basis for integration and starting an effective dialogue, not dialogue on the surface, but an effective and controversial dialogue to kind of controverse this mainstream that I have been describing through my whole speech, right? This media and political elites and so on.
So thank you so much, Natalia, for concluding up how the different methodologies and tools in the Eastern Partnership as well as Sweden can support each other to strengthen the voice of the marginalized groups, regardless of in which context that they live. So now we will sum up this seminar. So I believe that there are a lot of conclusions that can be drawn from this discussion. So first and foremost, I think that the examples presented in this panel especially have shown the urgency to increase the support to women, to LGBTQI people, and to youth, and that this support needs to be flexible and context-specific since the situation changes rapidly. I also believe that this discussion has managed to show that there are many similarities and differences between the countries in the Eastern Partnership region, but also with Sweden, and that we have a lot to learn from each other in how we can develop effective methods and tools, and to make societies more inclusive and safe for all. So thank you, dear panelists, for your contributions to this discussion. I highly appreciate that you took your time and that you shared your experiences with us in this forum. I would also like to thank the members of the Swedish Civil Society Network for Eastern Partnership and Russia, who actively have been contributing to the organization of this event. And finally, I would like to thank the technical team here in the studio in Stockholm. So if you have any questions, feedback, or comments, you can email me, sofia.strive@forumciv.org. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion and that we will meet again soon. So thank you, Dakuju, Digi Magloba, Snora Kalachun, tak.